Welcome back to BORI'S storybook. My name is Bori and I'm really glad that you're here. I might have only been 7 years old when I left my home in Hungary to come to the United States, but I was still old enough to remember the stories that were read to me when I was younger. Partially because story time was an important ritual in our house. The other reason I remember these stories so fondly is because they did an incredible job of capturing my imagination and whisking me away to magical worlds. Even though I am currently 22 years old, I still greatly enjoy the stories of my childhood. That is why I decided to write a story inspired by European folk tales. A really common thread of European folk tales is instances of reward and punishment. Usually the protagonist of these stories is an honest fellow who lives a modest life with few material goods available to him. Then one day the protagonist is going about his business when he encounters a being much more powerful than himself. However, the being will always be in some sort of disguise, so the protagonist doesn't know how powerful they truly are. Then the being proceeds to act like he's in trouble and needs the protagonist's help. And when the protagonist does the compassionate thing and agrees to help, the being reveals his true identity and rewards the protagonist for his kindness. On the other hand, most antagonists of European folktales are greedy, lazy, and heartless. The antagonist is usually incredibly wealthy, but they still want more and are unwilling to work for it. Throughout the course of the story, the antagonist will also encounter the powerful being who is once more hiding his true power. The being will also ask the antagonist for help, but he will be either too greedy or lazy to help him. So when the being shows his true self, he will punish the antagonist for being so heartless. My story, The Gnome King, is no different. It follows a similar pattern to the stories I was read growing up. The story's protagonist is a struggling young man named Finn. Finn lives a meager life with his wife in a hut next to a forest. Until one day he enters the forest, and by making the king of the gnomes very happy, all of his wildest dreams come true. I don't want to spoil any more of the plot here, so let's get into the read. The Gnome King. Long time ago, in a faraway kingdom, there lived a poor but good-hearted young man named Finn. He lived in an old run-down hut at the edge of a deep dark forest with his wife Martha. Finn and Martha might have struggled to put food on the table, but they did not let their less than ideal situation spoil their outlook on life. They were often seen whistling merrily as they picked mushrooms or helped their friends with various tasks. There was only one thing that could ruin Finn and Martha's mood. Ever since they had gotten married, they wished for a child of their own. At first, after their marriage, they had tried and tried, however their wish had not come true. So they hardly brought up the subject, not wanting to dwell on the negative. One day, while he was on his way to town, Finn was forced to cut through the forest. And as he walked along the narrow path that ran through a dark mass of trees, he saw the most peculiar thing. In the middle of the path, right by his feet, lay a moaning, crying gnome. Finn's heart went out to the little creature when he realized he was injured. His tiny hand was clutched around his ankle, which was sticking out at a concerning angle. The gnome made eye contact with Finn and spoke. "I am a long way from home and I seem to have hurt my ankle. Would you please carry me home? If you do, it will be worth your trouble. My father is the Gnome King. He loves me dearly and is sure to reward you handsomely." By this time, Finn felt a great deal of compassion for the little gnome and decided to help him, even if he really was not the Gnome King's son. So Finn heaved the gnome onto his back and started to carry him in the direction of the kingdom of the gnomes. However, almost as soon as they started their journey, something seemed wrong. The farther Finn carried the gnome, the heavier he became. In no time, Finn was sweating and grunting from the gnome's weight, and they weren't even halfway to their destination. As a result, Finn was starting to contemplate how he was going to finish his task. He really did not want to leave the gnome to starve, and leaving him behind to go get help was not a reliable option either. The forest was so thick and deep with trees that looked exactly the same that they would never be able to find each other again. However, if the gnome got any heavier, he physically would not be able to carry him all the way to his home. The day wore on, and by the time Finn reached the river that marked the last part of his journey, he was already starting to bend under the gnome's weight. The river was rushing swiftly when Finn picked his way across the bridge. Staring down at the cool, speedy water, Finn was shocked to realize how easy it would be to dump the gnome in the river and relieve himself of a terrible weight. What shocked him even more was that he knew several men who would have been callous enough to go through with it. However, Finn was not that kind of man. The sun was already starting to dip behind the clouds when Finn arrived in the kingdom of the gnomes. As soon as he entered the Gnome King's domain, the trees disappeared. Instead of them, the biggest mushrooms Finn had ever seen towered into the sky. In fact, some of them were so humongous that their tops seemed to brush the clouds. Finn could not stop himself from staring at the magical fungi. They were so breathtakingly beautiful. They sparkled in every color imaginable as they waved gently in the evening breeze. Under these mushrooms, tiny modest huts sat. Some were waiting patiently for their occupants to arrive, while the cooking scent of stew wafted from the others. As he walked through the field of mushrooms, Finn wished he could have lingered. However, by now the weight of the gnome was so much he was barely able to will himself forward. Fortunately, he was really close to his destination by now. The Gnome King lived just on the other side of the mushroom forest in a palace made of the finest crystals. Finn's jaws hit the ground and he was finally able to lay his eyes on the Gnome King's palace. It was so sparkly and shiny it nearly blinded him. Two heavily armed gnomes waved them inside when they saw Finn approach with the injured gnome. "You must be the kind-hearted human who helped my son," the Gnome King said when Finn finally entered the throne room. "I am incredibly pleased with your actions. You have passed my test and are entitled to great rewards." "Pardon me, Your Majesty, I am incredibly flattered by your praise and generosity, but I don't get how what happened was a test." Finn interrupted as politely as he could. With a wink, the Gnome King gestured to his son. "Son, you can get up now." And just like that, the gnome Finn had been carrying all day leapt from where he sat, and as he did it became evident to Finn that he had not hurt his ankle at all. And the whole reason he had even came to the kingdom of the gnomes was nothing but a ruse. "You see, my son was not really injured. I just asked him to lay out in the path and act injured to test the heart of man. We gnomes have a wide range of magic and riches at our disposal. And we are not greedy creatures. We would like to share our bounty with men. However, if we shared our gifts too enthusiastically and just let anyone benefit, it would be a total disaster. But you young human have acted in a merciful way and earned our respect. As a result, I will grant you 3 wishes. Take this magic ruby, and when you are ready to make your request, rub it between your fingers and your wishes will come true." As he spoke, the Gnome King took a tiny ruby from a pouch on his belt and handed it to Finn, who turned the shiny stone around and around in his hand. The ruby the Gnome King had given Finn was the size of his thumb and perfectly smooth. When the precious stone was laid in his hand, Finn's head started to spin, and he began to feel unsteady on his feet, for he knew that even a ruby this small was more wealth than he had ever possessed in his entire life. Finn slipped the precious stone gratefully into his pocket and bid the gnomes farewell. On his way out of the kingdom of the gnomes and the forest, Finn was in an incredibly joyous mood. He did not stop his merry whistling until the hut where he and Martha resided came into view. Martha ran to meet him as soon as the vague shadow of his figure appeared on the horizon. During the brief walk to the door, Finn filled Martha in on what had transpired while he was crossing the forest. "Do you know what this means?" Martha asked Finn after he was done telling the story of his incredible trip. "If you're sure you're ready to have a child, this is our big chance," he said in response to her question. "I'm sure I'm ready. I've been wanting a child ever since we got married," Martha said, shedding small tears. That very night, after Martha had gone to bed, Finn took the ruby the Gnome King had given him and rubbed it between his fingers, wishing for a child. A warm, tingling sensation started in the pit of Finn's stomach and spread throughout his entire body, leaving him feeling extremely peaceful and comforted. That night, Finn ended up slipping into his bed with a big smile on his face. The rays of the morning sun had barely started to filter in through the windows of the hut when Finn was awoken by the crying of a baby. When he opened his eyes, he could not believe them. There, between himself and Martha, a young baby lay, waving its small fists in the air. When he saw his child for the first time, Finn's chest expanded with immense joy, and he woke Martha as fast as he could. Celebrating their great joy, they laughed and cried together. Finn and Martha's new daughter was perfect in every way imaginable. There was only one unusual thing about her. Even though she could not have been more than a few hours old, she already had a full head of hair on her head. What was even more unusual than the quantity of her hair was the quality of it. Every strand on her head was pure gold. Finn and Martha could not stop smiling as they ran their hands through the incredible child's hair. Unfortunately, there were still many obstacles in front of them before they could just relax and raise their daughter. First of all, they didn't have enough money to support the girl, so for his next wish, Finn asked for financial security. The next morning when Finn woke up, his jaws hit the floor in amazement. Every corner of their home was covered in the most valuable coins and precious gems he had ever seen. Using their newfound wealth, Finn and Martha were able to finally replace their raggedy clothes and buy a few essential items for their baby. However, they didn't spend all of their money at once. They were sure to put plenty away for the future so they would never get in a tough situation again. The next order of business was for the family to move out of the rickety hut they still lived in and get their hands on a nicer house. Finn made the request, and when he awoke the next morning, the leaky, rickety hut was no more. Instead, the room that surrounded him was laden with luxury. Once again, Finn got to wake Martha to a scene of magical wonder. They wandered from room to room at their new house in a pleasant daze. They were so surprised by Gnome King's generosity. Every chair in the dining room was made of pure gold, and every single china in the cabinet shone silver. Aware of the fact that he had used his final wish, Finn reached into the pocket where he kept the ruby and was not at all surprised that his fingers met nothing but dust. The incredible stone had crumbled into uselessness overnight. However, he was happy to let go of the stone and just enjoy his newfound life. From that day on, Finn and his family lived a happy life full of comfort and ease. Unfortunately, not everyone was happy for Finn, and the most notable of these people was a greedy, shrewish man named Han. Han lived in a large, lavish house and was constantly waited on by several servants. He had everything he needed, but he was still always unhappy and negative. Han never helped his neighbors when they asked, and he took great pleasure in putting down anyone with less wealth than himself. As a result, Han and Finn had never really been fond of each other. So it was not surprising that when seemingly out of nowhere Finn walked into town wearing fancy clothes and boots, he was approached by Han and asked where he had acquired such sudden wealth. Finn disliked Han greatly. However, despite his better judgment, he told him all about his meeting with the king of the gnomes. Stricken by greed, Han ordered one of his servants to enter the forest in hopes of doubling his fortune. In order to entice the servant, he promised him a trunk full of gold if he brought the gift of the Gnome King back to him. After some wandering around, the servant too came across the Gnome King's son laying in the middle of the path clutching his ankle. "I am a long way from home and I seem to have hurt my ankle. Would you please carry me? If you do, it will be worth your trouble. My father is a Gnome King. He loves me dearly and is sure to reward you handsomely." The gnome asked, just like with Finn when he saw the servant approach. Alright, you clumsy fool, I will carry you, but the reward better be big, and if you trick me, you will regret it till the day you die. Hans' servant spat before shoving the gnome impatiently onto his back. Cursing under his breath, the servant trudged through the dense forest with the gnome on his back, and just like he did with Finn, the gnome got heavier and heavier with every step the servant took. For the longest time, the promise of a trunk full of gold was enough to keep the servant marching obediently forward. However, when they came to the river, things took a turn for the worse. The water under the bridge was speeding along as violently as before. Staring down at the rushing water, the servant decided the gold was not worth the physical exertion. As a result, he decided to dump the gnome into the water and tell Han he fell in by mistake. So with a mighty shove, he tipped the gnome over the side of the bridge and into the freezing water below. Greatly relieved, the servant watched the top of the gnome's head disappear under the blanket of water. Certain that the gnome was dead, the servant turned around and headed back home. Fortunately, the Gnome King's son did not drown. As soon as his head disappeared under the veil of water, he teleported back to his father's palace. Once he sat next to his father, the gnome told him everything that had transpired in the forest. Han is a terrible, lazy human. He must be punished for sending his servant to do his dirty work. That was quite underhanded of him, the Gnome King said once his son finished with his report. What about the servant? He was the one that dumped me in the river, the Gnome Prince added. He will be dealt with in his own right. I have to go now. I have a plan to teach the cruel humans a lesson, the Gnome King said as he teleported back to the forest. The servant had barely left the river behind when out of nowhere an elderly gnome with a crown on his head appeared, blocking his path towards home. Good evening, young human. I am the king of the gnomes, he said to the servant. Why are you here? The servant asked him in a frightened voice. After what had happened at the river, he was quite nervous about the appearance of the magical ruler. I'm sure you have heard of the terrible news. My only son drowned quite tragically in a river not far from here. Oh yes, your son had hurt his ankle earlier today and I offered to carry him home. Unfortunately, as we were crossing the river, he slipped from my back and fell over the edge of the bridge. I am deeply in your debt, kind-hearted human. Even though my son is no longer with us, it gives me a comforting feeling knowing that you are so kind to him when he was in need. The Gnome King said, trying to make his voice sound grieving but touched instead of enraged. To show you how much I appreciate your good-hearted nature, I am going to give you a special gift. As he said this, the king pulled a tiny piece of obsidian from his pouch. That rock is so small it must not be very valuable. Are you sure you don't have something bigger? The servant asked. Concerned that if he knew too much, the servant would keep the Gnome King's gift to himself, Han did not tell him about the wishes. So he was worried that if he was not pleased with the size of the gift, Han would not give him the trunk full of gold he promised. Don't worry, my dear friend, it is not the size or quality of the stone that makes this gift so incredibly valuable. It is the great magic it possesses. You see, using this rock you can make 3 of your wildest dreams come true. All you have to do is take the stone and rub it between the palms of your hands, and by the following morning your wish will come true. On his way home, the servant could not have been more pleased with how the day had played out. He didn't have to carry the bratty little gnome all the way, and he was still going to get his reward when he hands the magical obsidian over to Han. The only thing he would have wanted to be different is he wished he would have had the courage to use the obsidian on himself. However, he decided to make do with the gold. He was too scared of Han's wrath to double-cross him. When the servant arrived at the outskirts of town, the sun had dipped behind the horizon and the sky was dotted with stars. However, he did not care about the lateness of the hour. He just hurried over to Han's house and knocked on the door boldly, barely able to contain the greed that bubbled in his heart. When the door opened and Han stuck his head out, he was wearing the same expression of barely contained greed that his servant was trying to hide when he rested his eyes on the grinning, eager face. "Did you get me what you promised?" Han asked as he widened the crack formed by the door in order to let his servant in. When the two men had taken seats opposite each other in the well-lit room, the servant slipped the obsidian from his pocket and handed it to Han. As soon as the smooth rock left the servant's hand, a bright bolt of lightning arced into the room from an open window and hit him in the back of the head. He fell sideways from his chair with the force of the impact and landed dead on the ground. Even though he had to admit it was sudden and unusual, Han was not at all fazed by the servant's death. Instead, he was grateful for his demise. Even though Han had promised to pay his servant a trunk full of gold in exchange for the Gnome King's gift, he had no intention of going through with this transaction. He had planned to just take the wishes and kick his servant out in the rudest fashion imaginable without giving him anything. Now, thanks to the mysterious bolt of lightning, the dirty work was already done for him. Unaware of the fact that his servant had been destroyed by the Gnome King's fury and that he too had awakened quite a great deal of anger in him, Han tried out the obsidian and made a wish. So he slipped the stone out of his pocket and rubbed it between the palms of his hands, wishing for a more beautiful wife. Han was already married to the most beautiful woman in his part of the world. Her smile shone with gorgeous radiance whenever he turned to face her. While he acknowledged that she was beautiful, he knew there were more beautiful women out there, and he often found himself wishing he would have met them first. After Han had finished making his wish, the most terrifying feeling he had ever experienced bounced on him out of nowhere, filling his head with worry and fear, not allowing him to sleep all night. By the time the rays of the sun had started to warm the house, Han was worn completely ragged, and he was starting to wonder if the obsidian was really going to work. However, when he looked over at the body laying next to him, a pleasant surprise met his eyes. Sometime over the course of the night, his wife had disappeared without his notice. And in her spot lay a woman that could easily put her to shame with her big wide eyes and wavy locks. Han and his new wife made eye contact as they moved into a passionate hug. Han was extremely happy in the company of his new spouse. However, his joy was not to last long. Not even an hour after she came into his life, Han's new love contracted a terrible fever that left her very ill. She was dead by the end of the day. After his wife died, Han tried to find his old wife and convince her to come back to him. However, no matter how hard he searched, she was nowhere to be found. Extremely lonely but not at all close to discovering that the obsidian Gnome King had given him was cursed, Han made a second wish that night. Thinking that asking for more money could not backfire, he wished to double his fortune. After spending another terrible night gripped by fear, Han awoke to find that every inch of his humongous house was covered in gold and precious gems. Upon setting his eyes on a sea of riches, Han rejoiced. In fact, he had never been so overjoyed in his entire life. Suddenly feeling even more cocky than he usually did, Han decided to go for a strut around town and brag to everyone he met about his newly doubled wealth. He had a lovely morning in town. However, when Han got home and opened the door, his day was instantly ruined. Somehow, while he had been away showing off and embarrassing anyone who was not as well off as he was, all the wealth in his house had turned into venomous spiders and scorpions, which attacked Han, biting him violently. Somehow, he managed to escape. However, Han could not return to his house because the aggressive vermin would not leave. Cold and distressed, Han took the obsidian out of his pocket to make his final wish. Thinking that using his last wish to find a suitable place to live and rekindle his lost wealth would be the smartest move, so Han wished to be crowned king. To Han's absolute delight, when he woke, he found himself dozing on the throne, with a crown that kings usually wear sitting on his head. He had a wonderful day ordering his subjects around. However, before even a whole day could pass, a group of heavily armed men burst into the throne room shouting for his demise. And since no one liked him because he had been a terrible and unjust king, no one stood up for him. Everyone just stood there and watched as the uprisers chased him out of the throne room and the country, never allowing him to return. That was the Gnome King. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you read any European folktales yourself, please tell me what you thought of them in the comments below. Also, if you'd like to hear more writing, please like and subscribe, and see you next time.